Sergei Alexandrovich Golovkin was born in 1959 in Moscow. His childhood was reportedly nothing out of the ordinary. Now, in Soviet Russia, an ordinary childhood did not mean what it means in the affluent West. Golovkin's mother was silent, uncommunicative, withdrawn, and was constantly busy with household chores. She preferred to spend family time on reading or handicrafts. She was distinguished by a tendency to dominate. She was arrogant and usually noticed only those who begged for her attention. The father in the family was more sociable and lively in character, but unlike his ordinary wife, he had a sin. He was a heavy drinker. Both parents coincided only in their desire for suppression of others, submission to their will. Aspirations of the husband and wife for domination in the family led to sharp conflicts between them, which did not contribute to the creation of an atmosphere of home comfort in the family and later ended in divorce. In childhood, Golovkin was often ill. He wet his bed and frequently vomited. Parents treated this without proper tact and understanding. The father tried to raise his son in a Spartan way. He poured ice water over him, causing screeching and trauma. Since then, Golovkin disliked everything related to showering, bathing, and washing with water. Later in life, often did not bother to clean himself using water, which sometimes shocked others. It is even more important to note that there was no emotionally close and warm relationship between the parents and Golovkin, and he felt alienated and alone growing up. It was not customary in his family to caress and kiss a child, to tell him fairy tales. And if the parents wanted to instill some rules and skills, they forced him to do it rudely, straightforwardly, unceremoniously, sometimes using physical violence such as beating him with fists and/or a belt. Such family upbringing, the increased unyielding nature of his parents, the desire they had to mold their child to their will, combined with coldness and detachment, led to the fact that Golovkin grew up quiet, withdrawn, and preferring loneliness to games with peers. He did not see examples of normal human communication in front of him, since all communication in the family sometimes boiled down to making claims against him, emphasizing the shortcomings of little Sergei, which gave him numerous complexes. So, he remained forever alienated, shy, confident in his inferiority, did not trust anyone, including his parents, and he had no friends. All this was further aggravated by his increased vulnerability, anxiety, fear of doing something wrong. If he communicated with peers, he forced himself to do so because he was afraid of ridicule and did not want to look funny, but generally preferred to stay aside and lead an imperceptible grey existence. He was quite successful in such a life, and if he communicated with someone, then they were the same outsiders as he was, poor students, oppressed and persecuted boys and girls. However, he did not come into close contact with them either, and over time he became even more closed and at the same time even more sensitive and riddled with psychological complexes. His vulnerability and anxiety increased even more in adolescence, when he grew tall and lanky, began to slouch, acne appeared on his face, and he began to actively masturbate, which caused even more anxiety for him. He believed that his comrades were well aware of his quote-unquote secrets. Around the same time, he began to constantly smoke cheap cigarettes, starting with cigarette butts picked up from the street. And soon, he could no longer live without nicotine. As a young adolescent man, Golovkin never got to develop naturally. He never participated in peer conversations on sexual topics. The topic was largely taboo in school, or at least restricted to the most basic biological function of sex, and it was never discussed at home. His sexuality has been brought into question many times, but has never been concluded upon. In later interviews, he claims to have always been attracted to girls, but he never managed to develop relationships with girls as a young man. He was simply afraid to approach them. S. Slobodin, a classmate of Golovkin, stated in a later interview the following, and I quote, "The girls liked the guys who were well-dressed and passionate about music, and he was stooped, pimply, and no one paid attention to him." End quote. Golovkin attended the Moscow Secondary School number 167 in the northwest of Moscow. A few of Sergei's classmates were Armen Grigoryan, Alexander Sevastovanov, and Igor Schuldinger, who organized a group called Black Spots, which, after undergoing a series of transformations, later became known as Crematorium. The girls liked the guys with the guitars, and they, in turn, knew to take advantage of this fact. Apartment concerts, parties, constant wine and sexual adventures. This was the surroundings of school number 167. And Golovkin, who was closed, unsociable, immersed in himself and his problems, gradually lost touch with the people around him, who he felt as incomprehensible, alien, hostile figures. But despite his emotional coldness, Golovkin had fierce sworn enemies. Once, at the end of his studies at the academy, an event occurred that radically changed the fate of Golovkin. He was severely beaten by teenagers, and he received multiple head injuries. His teeth were knocked out, and his nose was broken. Since then, the feeling of revenge completely dominated his thoughts. He looked everywhere for his offenders, but did not find them. Gradually, this feeling was transformed into a kind of general sadistic revenge towards boys aged 12 to 14 years. Since he really could not take revenge on the actual offenders, he constantly thought about how he would rape and kill them, always while masturbating. In Golovkin's mind, these offenders were always boys, his pursuers and destroyers. They not only mocked him and beat him, that was only the half of it, but with their health, relaxed and free behavior, cheerfulness and sociability of youth, with all their appearance, they challenged him. He was awkward, grey, ugly, despised. They showed him his insignificance, his ejection from life. He hated them with all his being, hated passionately to the point of losing his mind, and wished for a cruel, incomparable death. So, over time, his dreaminess and isolation changed, turning into sadistic fantasies. Usually, before the act of masturbation, he imagined sexual intercourse with classmates. This would be boys, not with girls, and he tortured them, imagining himself as a fascist torturing young pioneer heroes. Boys just like his classmates, who were naked and wriggling with pain in a frying pan or burning at the stake. He imagined slashing into their chest the profiles of Hitler or devils with horns. Sometimes he fantasized about these topics among random people, for example on the street. But Golovkin did not limit himself to fantasies. Once he burst through, irresistibly wanting to realize all those bright, mesmerizing, and at the same time repulsive pictures that were in his head. At about the age of 13, he caught a cat and purposefully brought it home just to torture it. He hung the cat and cut off its head, from which he got a very pleasant sensation. The desired release came. The tension in which he constantly stayed subsided. After that, according to Golovkin, he had dreams of exhuming a corpse and dismembering it. In another instance, he lowered a red-hot piece of iron into his aquarium with fish in, order to see what would happen to its inhabitants when the water boiled. In high school, he developed a passion that determined his future profession: horses. Perhaps for him it was the only outlet in life, something that helped to somehow compensate for the lack of friends and social interactions in real life. Next to the house where Sergei Golovkin lived was a hippodrome, and he spent all his free time there, rode horses, looked after them, picked up literature, studied horse breeding, and later entered a special evening school. Unsurprisingly, his parents did not approve of the choice of their son. His father was especially unrestrained, who, in his favorite insulting and bullying manner, claimed that this was an occupation for morons. Be that as it may, Golovkin showed a firmness uncharacteristic for him before, which spoke of the exceptional importance and significance of his chosen occupation for himself. So he continued his studies at the equestrian school at the Timiryazev Academy. During this time, his life was completely devoted to horses. He especially loved stroking foals. The smell that came from them, milk and light sweat, agitated him. In the equestrian section, he even had a friend who taught him all the intricacies of riding. He studied hard, was even a komsomol organizer. But in the student collective, he still remained a dark horse. He did not stand out in any way, and, as before, was not interested in girls. He did develop a small student friendship with a fellow female student, but it did not even have a hint of a sexual nature. According to her recollections, at one of the parties they attended, he always sat at the table and ate like an animal, not paying attention to anyone. Golovkin did not love anyone, and was not drawn to anyone, and he never had sex with a woman. On a psychological level, Golovkin repeated with the girls the relationship he had with his mother earlier, a relationship devoid of warmth and feeling. Golovkin seemingly never developed any real interest in women. Over time, Golovkin developed a sexual sadistic stereotype. He was satisfied only by imagining a very specific object that tortures and then kills. He dreamed of violent sodomy, and this is by no means a coincidence that homosexual drives, like Golovkin's sadism, were first realized at the level of fantasy before becoming reality. Unfortunately, his estrangement from girls and women also played a fatal role. Unable to practice traditional sex, he not only killed children and young men, but also satisfied his sexual needs with them. Actually, this was not sex in the original sense of the word. Homosexual contacts for Golovkin primarily mattered as a method of torture, punishment, and humiliation of a teenager, and sometimes acquired an extremely cruel, sadistic character. Golovkin's first attempts to realize his fantasies in reality came in the summer of 1982. He met a boy on a forest path, asked for help to bring a sack. But the boy, sensing something was wrong, ran away. Golovkin did not pursue him, but the experience took his breath away. That summer, he met a boy of about 14, as he later recalled that he was, quote-unquote, pierced by an electric charge. The boy was picking mushrooms. Golovkin pounced on him, but could not strangle him. The victim managed to escape. This did not in any way deter Golovkin. His interest and excitement only increased. In the same year of 1982, after graduating from the academy, he got a job at the Moscow Stud Farm No. 1, which is located on the territory of the village of Gorky 10 in the Odintsovo district of the Moscow region. At work, he was treated well. Someone noted his extraordinary capacity for work and diligence. He was even nominated for a silver medal at the Exhibition of Economic Achievements of the USSR. The women of the stud farm treated the young bachelor with an eternal feeling of pity. Sometimes they fed him, and even more daringly left their children with him, to which the zoo technician Golovkin treated with visible love. Several teenagers always hovered around him, whom Golovkin skillfully interested in stories about horses. He even allowed them to be present at insemination, which was not allowed by other adults. Working as a veterinarian, Golovkin often inseminated mares, while his eyes either glittered or became cloudy. He seemed to be in a trance, and everyone around him noticed this oddity. Putting on a special glove and checking the mares for fertility, he began to feel for a long time the internal genital organs of the animal, receiving such great satisfaction from this that sometimes he even sang. For such a closed, self-absorbed person, this was not at all typical, and indicated that at that moment he was really experiencing incomparable feelings. Thus, the secret, passionate craving for sex life and everything connected with it, which manifested itself in him early and remained at a high level throughout his life, gradually began to acquire more and more perverted forms. The unsociable, withdrawn, infantile Golovkin was tormented by loneliness and did not find his place among his new acquaintances. The experiences associated with adolescence were still extremely relevant for him. These experiences were somewhat repressed from his active consciousness, but acquired autonomy and began to confidently guide his behavior. The more he psychologically moved away from people, the more stimulating power they gained. He often wandered through the woods and watched children through the bushes, pondering plans for possible attacks, and waited for one of the potential victims to leave the safety of their surroundings. And so it was that in the summer of 1984, he finally had an opportunity to make his depraved fantasies come true. From the testimony of the victim, Andrei K., I quote, "I was in the pioneer camp and I went outside the camp to smoke. I did not go far. Suddenly I felt that someone was touching my shoulder. An unknown young man in a green wind jacket took out a knife and threateningly tied my hands behind my back, put something on my head, possibly a cap, and said, 'Go to the forest if you want to live.' There, he put a knife to my stomach and ordered me to lie face down. I don't remember what happened next. I was looking for something for a long time, running through the woods. I was in shock. The doctors later found the marks on my neck from the rope." End quote. What had happened was that Golovkin hung this boy on a tree, took off all his clothes, and masturbated as he watched the naked boy dangling and slowly suffocating. Then, seeing that the victim showed no signs of life, he brought the boy down. Golovkin did not even attempt to have sexual intercourse with the boy. Fortunately, the boy did not die. Within a month after this meeting with the serial killer, he was in the hospital with a diagnosis of post-hypoxic encephalopathy. But in time, he luckily recovered. Golovkin was very upset by the experience, comprehending it, pondering options for new attacks. He had not managed to rape the boy and was disappointed with himself. At some point, he even decided to give up rape. He was very much afraid of exposure. He decided to act affectionately, made an attempt to seduce a 17-year-old boy. He did this by trying to lure him to the stud farm in the evening and gave him alcohol. Then put him in bed and took his penis into his mouth. But the boy refused oral sex with Golovkin and even ridiculed him. This failure completely paralyzed Golovkin's will. He waited in terror for his arrest for several months and even thought about suicide. Only after making sure that the unsuccessful attempt at seduction did not entail any consequences, he gradually grew bolder and returned to the idea of attacks on boys. Golovkin made an attempt at the next encroachment on a child in 1986. Imagine, if you will, dear listener, Saturday, the 19th of April, 1986, 5 o'clock in the evening. Leaving the train at the abattoir station of the Dmitrovsky district of the Moscow region, Golovkin walked for some time through the woods toward the Truduyaya station. He was overtaken on a bicycle by a 16-year-old teenager. It was Andrei Pavlov, who had come to visit his grandparents in a neighboring village. On this day, the boy collected birch sap and periodically traveled around the forest for this purpose. After a while, Golovkin caught up with him as the boy arranged a small smoke break for himself. Golovkin came up to the boy, asked for a match, and then, threatening with a knife, dragged the teenager into the forest, where, having previously tied his hands with a rope, he raped him anally. After ejaculating inside the boy, he took a rope out of his bag and strangled the boy nearly to death. When the boy began to regain consciousness, he cut open his throat with a knife. The boy bled to death on the forest floor in utter agony. After the boy had expired, Golovkin went berserk on the body. He stabbed at the dead body furiously in the neck, chest, and groin. The search for the missing boy began in the late afternoon and continued the next morning. The boy's body was found by his own father. The scene of the crime clearly spoke of the sexual undertones of the murder. The corpse was naked. The genitals had obvious wounds. Nearby lay a bicycle and a 3-liter jar prepared for birch sap. No obvious evidence was found at the crime scene. The fingerprints left on the bike frame belonged to individuals with a solid alibi. A survey of local residents showed that on the day of the murder, some saw a tall, black-haired, stooped man with a pimply face who had not previously appeared there. The young pioneer camps of the Soviet Union were the place of vacation for children from the Young Pioneer Organization of the Soviet Union during summer and winter holidays. The summer of what was then known as the Pioneer Summer of 1986 came, and noisy and cheerful children appeared in numerous summer camps for children. None of them could even imagine that at that moment one of the most dangerous and cruel killers in the history of the USSR was walking next to them in search of a victim. The idyllic scene of warm summer and camp frolicking came to an end on the 11th of July, when a 14-year-old teenager named Alexei disappeared from the Zvezhny pioneer camp. Golovkin, now establishing his modus operandi, watched the boy in the forest. He approached him when he was alone, tied him up while threatening him with a knife, and took him to a remote place deep in the forest. There, he raped the boy anally. Then, realizing a dream that he had long cherished, he hung him from a tree, presenting himself as a fascist punisher. Golovkin, according to his confessions, most of all enjoyed the agony of his victim. He rejoiced at seeing the boy's limbs trembling, his involuntary defecation, his involuntary urination, his tongue protruding from suffocation, his eventual frozen facial features. From the corpse hanging on a branch, he cut off the genitals and put them in a pre-prepared bag. Then he opened the abdominal cavity, making an incision with a knife from the chest down to the pelvic bones. Not satisfied with this, he removed the corpse from the branch, freed it from the ropes, began randomly stabbing it with a knife, grabbing the hair, cutting the throat, and then completely separating the head from the body. Being in an extremely agitated state, Golovkin at first wanted to take the boy's head with him, but then, after a few hundred meters, he threw it away. The boy's corpse was found the next day, on the evening of the 12th of July, in a forest thicket, 800 meters from the Zvezhny pioneer camp, located near the village of Ugriumuvu, Odintsuvu district. The tableau that the detectives saw at the crime scene amazed them with its inhuman cruelty. And with that, we come to the end of part 1 in this Russian exposé. Next episode, number 156 in number, will continue the saga. So, as they say in the land of radio, stay tuned. Finally, I wish to thank you, dear listener, for listening. If you like this podcast, you can support it by donating on patreon.com/The Serial Killer Podcast, by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, facebook.com/The SK Podcast, or by posting on the subreddit The SK Podcast. Thank you. Good night. Good luck. Less than a month After the discovery of the gutted boy, not far from the Odintsovo village of Zarasheye, in the Mezherskoye recreation area, detectives found the corpse of another brutally murdered 16-year-old boy. He, too, had been stabbed with a knife. The killer had stabbed the body 35 times, and had then completely cut off the head. The penis was also sliced off, and was nowhere to be found. The boy, who was an athlete, had been murdered as he had been on his daily run along the lake. It became obvious that a very dangerous individual was stalking the Moscow region. At the Odintsovo Department of Internal Affairs, a large investigative operational group was created, including employees of the prosecutor's office and the police. One of the young witnesses told the detectives that when he and a 14-year-old teenager who had turned up murdered were walking through the forest near the pioneer camp, they met an unfamiliar tall man with a scar. The man had apparently been delighted to meet the boys and talk to them. The adult identified himself as Fischer and confidentially told them that he had been convicted but managed to escape from the gulag, and now the police were strenuously looking for him. Then something supposedly had angered the man, and he attacked the teenagers. As the witness explained, he managed to escape and run away, and hiding in the bushes, he saw with his own eyes how the man calling himself Fischer killed his friend. This story from the very beginning looked too fantastic, too theatrical, and given that a horror story about a certain Fischer was already circulating among the children in the pioneer camps by that time, this testimony was taken with a huge grain of salt. Nevertheless, it could not be left unchecked, and the search for Fischer, either a convict or a chess player or a fisherman, or perhaps the owner of such a surname, was launched. According to the description of the boy, they were looking for a tall, broad-shouldered man, about 30 years old, with a scar on his face. He spoke with a dialect, and the witness described how the man had a tattoo on his right hand in the form of a snake wrapped around a sword and the word Fischer. The story of the mysterious Fischer, with the ominous tattoo and menacing scar, would prove to be false. The task force had spared no expense in searching for him, and not a single unverified Fischer remained on the territory of the USSR. But there were no results. The longer this search went on, the more descriptions of Fischer appeared, which sometimes contradicted each other. Fischer became multifaceted and acquired the status of a legend, a myth. As soon as a man approached boys, suspicions arose, and whether it was Fischer. There were numerous rumors about Fischer. In all pioneer camps, the Fischer horror stories were the highlight of the program. Children frightened each other, parents warned their children against communicating with strangers, and were themselves afraid of them. Fischer's name became a household name. It was written on the walls of houses, carved on benches. Songs were composed about Fischer. Fischer's name thundered all over the country. Naturally, Golovkin himself had a very indirect relationship to this, but he did not fail to use the quote-unquote magic of this name and used it with pleasure later. Before killing his victims, he informed them that it was he who was that legendary Fischer, and enjoyed the horror that was reflected on the faces of the children who could not believe that their stupid childhood horror stories at that moment suddenly became a reality, and much more terrible than they even imagined. Simultaneously with the search for the elusive Fischer, all kinds of criminals were sifted through the investigative sieve. A huge contingent of prisoners, previously convicted rapists and murderers, as well as homosexuals, people prone to outbursts of sexual aggression, were all scrutinized. No breakthrough came. According to the period of the crimes committed, the Odintsovo killer coincided with the, in the West at least, much more famous Rostov Ripper. The methods, murder, dismemberment, mockery of the corpse, also largely coincide, although the direction was different. If the Rostov Ripper, who, as my listeners know, was none other than Andrei Chikatilo, attacked both women, boys, and girls, then here the selectivity was obvious. This killer chose only boys of a certain age. Police officers, trying to figure out whether these series of murders were somehow connected with each other, turned to scientists for help. The head of the All-Union Scientific and Methodological Center for Sexopathology, Professor G. Vasilchenko, having studied the materials, gave them the following recommendations, and I quote, "Sexual actions of the criminal can be regarded as necrosadism, sadism in relation to corpses, selectively aimed at adolescents. The case has something in common with the murders in the Rostov region. Generally, brutality, stab wounds, most traumatic injuries occur in the victim's anomalous or post-mortem state. In all cases, the genitals are damaged or excised. Some change in the ritual in raising the age of the boy who attracts the murderer is possible, since in the Rostov region both the ritual and the age of the victims changed. All patients who have consulted doctors about sexual difficulties should be identified. This is possible only with a total check of sexological case histories. It is necessary to pay attention to persons in contact with adolescents, such as teachers, educators, coaches, club leaders, and especially to those who left or were fired from this job. The search circle can be narrowed after determining the blood group and subsequent examination of the phallograph." End quote. A note to my dear listeners. A phallograph is the method still used in the West where suspected or convicted sexual offenders have a measuring apparatus attached to their penis. The suspect is then exposed to various photos or video in order to determine whether he is aroused by them or not. Typically, this method is mostly used to determine if a criminal is a pedophile or not. The specialists' recommendations formed the basis for the work of the detectives. In 1988 alone, 5,799 mentally ill persons prone to sex crimes were identified. Later, the Rostov Ripper himself, Chikatilo, were targeted as a prime suspect in the Odintsovo series of murders. However, officers of the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department, seconded to the Rostov region, became convinced that the modus operandi of the Rostov murders was somewhat different from what they saw in the Moscow region. Neither the Rostov Ripper nor the murderers who underwent a thorough check were suitable for the role of the killer, who by now was known as the boa constrictor. Golovkin himself, according to a later version of the investigation, hid from 1986 to 1989, and Russian authorities claimed he did not commit any murders in this period. Golovkin was preparing for the further continuation of the hunt for children, but in other forms, more consistent with his perverted fantasies. While killing and raping in the forest, he could not fully enjoy the violence. He was constantly afraid that he would be detected. He wanted complete solitude and privacy. According to Golovkin himself, in later interviews, he said the following, and I quote, "I wanted to torture the boys for a long time, and painfully, as I saw in my fantasies. I wanted to see their humiliation, to hear pleas for mercy." End quote. In 1988, he bought himself a car. It was the Soviet-produced VAZ-2103 in dark beige color. He stored it in a garage located at a stud farm. He then dug a basement in the garage. Later, Golovkin said, and I quote, "I dug a cellar where I first intended to make a workshop. But then I got the idea to use the cellar for sexual acts and crimes." End quote. Later, he concreted the floor, lined the walls with concrete slabs, fixed rings in the walls, attached a ladder to the ceiling on which any load could be suspended. Golovkin screwed 2 powerful lamps into the basement ceiling so that his bloody pleasures took place in bright electric light. Preparing his abattoir, he relished in the anticipation of the joy he would feel once he got his first victim tied down. He was confident that the subspace beneath his garage would be ideal, so that he could be sure that no one would interrupt or interfere with his crimes. The category of boys had also changed. By now he was targeting those who ran away from home, whom their parents would not immediately miss, whom they might not even look for. He often went in search of boys in the evenings. He looked for his victims using binoculars. There were several tricks in his arsenal. First, he always paid attention to smoking teenagers loitering around. He stopped, asked for matches, struck up a light conversation. He did it well. He often suggested to the boys they rob a kiosk, steal cigarettes, vodka, and money. Oftentimes, the boy would accede to the criminal plan. According to Golovkin, this gave him a reason to justify the murder. If the child did not agree to unlawful actions, then Golovkin instantly lost interest in him, since he did not correspond to the image of a bully, like those hooligans who had beat and humiliated him so many years ago. He brought the boys looking for unlawful adventures in his trunk, explaining to them that it was necessary in order to successfully rob a place. Behind the garage doors, Golovkin, who had first seemed a harmless and rather timid person, turned into a beast. Here, slowly, he carefully prepared the ritual of murder. He undressed and forced the victim to undress. Then he forced the boy to be shackled to the wall or the table in the middle of the little slaughter room. Once the boy was securely locked in place, Golovkin would take his time. He would use a knife to slowly torture the young boy, slicing deep cuts all over his body, causing extreme pain and fear. In between sessions of physical torture, Golovkin would anally rape the boy without lube, causing internal bleeding, until Golovkin climaxed. Then he would continue the torture, until he once again felt he could commit a rape to completion. After several hours of unimaginable pain, horror, and humiliation, Golovkin would slowly strangle the child while looking into the eyes of the terrified boy, seeing the life literally go out of him. Once the boy was dead, Golovkin would continue the mutilation of the body, removing intestines, slicing off the penis, the testicles, and oftentimes the head and hands as well. By July of 1990, the body of one of the many missing children in the area was found. A dismembered corpse, or rather separate skeletal parts of the body. Bone remains scattered and taken away by animals were found in an area outside the cities of Zvenigorod and Istra. It took the police officers several days to collect the remains. The examination established that presumably these were the remains of a student of Pereshuskoye Secondary School, Sergei P., who lived in the village of Kryokovo, Odentsovo district. The child had been reported missing since the 23rd of September 1989. He was last seen at a bus stop, go to Moscow. At that time, the survey of bus drivers and conductors did not give any results. Apparently, the boy never got on the bus, and perhaps had preferred to hitchhike to Moscow. It took 3 years to ascertain clearly what exactly happened that day. From the materials of the criminal case, and I quote, "At about 6 p.m., Golovkin put 15-year-old Sergei in his car at the Pereshuskovo railway station in the Odentsovo district, fraudulently brought him to the garage, and forced him to go down to a specially equipped basement. There, threatening with a knife, he stripped the boy and committed several violent sexual acts with him in various forms. Then Golovkin tied his hands behind his back, threw a rope loop around his neck and strangled the boy. Then, mocking the corpse, the killer hung him by his legs from the ceiling, cut off his nose and ears, severed his head, inflicted many knife cuts on the body, and cut out the internal and genital organs. With the help of surgical knives and an axe, Golovkin dismembered the corpse, cut out soft tissues, fried them on a blowtorch, and ate them. He kept the severed head in the garage. He opened the skull, burned out the brain, and gradually separated the skin and soft tissues. Later, Golovkin showed Sergei's skull to other victims for intimidation purposes." End quote. In August 1990, another boy disappeared near the military town of Vlashishka. And again, the investigation remained for a long time in complete ignorance about the further fate of the child. October 1990. 2 more boys go missing. The parents of the pupils of the Malovdyashkemskaya Secondary School, a 6th and 9th grader, reported the disappearance to the police. For more than 8 months, the parents lived in painful anticipation of the black news. Dismembered corpses of children were found on the 16th of July 1991. On the 22nd of August 1991, Nikita Bogdanov, a teenager born in 1976, a resident of the Nevolin State Farm, disappeared on his way to visit his step-grandmother in the village of Gorky 10. As Golovkin later admitted, in August 1991, on Rublevo-Ushpenskoye highway, near the village of Ushpenskoye, he put a boy in his car. Golovkin offered the boy to take part in the robbery of a kiosk, but a tool needed to break into it supposedly had to be taken from his garage. Having lured the teenager into his garage, Golovkin tortured, raped, and murdered the boy. After committing acts of sodomy, he hanged him, dismembered the body, bled the body into a bath, and amputated the penis and testicles. Golovkin was not satisfied with these experiments. He also removed the skin from this unfortunate boy and salted it. He took the remains in 2 steps into the forest, to the area of the Polyana boarding house, and buried them 50 meters from the country road. He burned the victim's clothes near his garage. No more than 50 days later, on the 13th of October, the remains of Nikita Bogdanov were exhumed. The terrible death of another child, no matter how cynical it sounds, gave the investigation valuable new information. In August 1991, Moscow and the Moscow region were literally flooded with police and the military. In connection with the creation of the State Emergency Committee and the attempt to remove the president of the USSR, M.S. Gorbachev, in the days when the child was abducted, a state of emergency was declared in the country. Naturally, both the movement from the city to the region and the appearance of non-resident citizens in the near Moscow region were difficult. Therefore, with a high degree of certainty, it could be assumed that the crime was committed by a local resident, who also had a car and a place where he could commit his atrocities. Another important point was that the skin removed from the boy was salted with unrefined feed salt. Only a limited number of people could have access to such quantities of salt. All this determined the further directions of the search. The investigation focused its efforts on the search for a local resident, the owner of a vehicle related to the livestock industry. But inspections of local residents did not give any definite results. Strange as it may seem, in the extensive lists of suspicious persons compiled as a result of these checks, there was no place only for the main culprit of all the events that took place. The fact is that Golovkin still had a Moscow residence permit. But in order not to waste time on trips to Moscow and back, on the territory of the stud farm he was allocated a room on the second floor in one of the administrative buildings. Golovkin's dwelling was an ordinary room. A sofa, a wardrobe, a desk littered with documents bearing the legible signature of the animal breeder Golovkin. The windows of his room overlooked the fields, covered with emerald grass. Behind them, on a low hill, stood the stud farm's office and the inconspicuous box of its green garage. Looking out the window, Golovkin could see the symbol of his power every day. Golovkin, according to his registration, was considered a Muscovite, and thus, at that moment, did not interest the law enforcement agencies. The investigation received new terms of operation in 1992, when the notorious Vladimir Ilyich Kolesnikov was appointed head of the main Directorate of Criminal Investigation of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation, who personally detained in 1990 the most famous and elusive psychopath of the USSR, Andrei Chikatilo. The crimes committed by the elusive Fischer had a wide public response, and it was viewed as necessary to take prompt measures to capture this criminal. So it was that on the 2nd of April, 1992, the case was taken over by the senior investigator for especially important cases under the Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation, Senior Counselor of Justice, Yevgeny Bakin. Bakin had the necessary experience in searching for psychopaths, since in the late 80s he was involved in the investigation of the Chikatilo case. An investigative operational group was created again, which included mostly fresh personnel. The search was headed by the senior operative of the GUUR of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia, Police Major Vladimir Chakai. At that time, these were dozens of volumes of a criminal case, which included 3 episodes: the murders of teenagers in 1986. But there were still similar murders in 1989, 1990, and 1991. On the 3rd of April, Bakin brought these cases together. Bakin stated in a later interview the following: and I quote, "When I studied the case and the available information on the crimes committed in the Odin-Suvu region against adolescents, I had a version that the last murders were committed by the same person. In addition, it became clear that serious changes had taken place in the life of the criminal. In 1986, he did not have a quote-unquote clinic, a permanent place where he could butcher corpses. He went to hunt children. But there was an element of chance in it. The boa constrictor never knew in advance who would be his victim. He filmed anyone, practically the first one he came across. He could stand and watch whoever gets caught. Then, in 1986, the boa constrictor killed where he attacked. He practically did not hide the first dead bodies. A tuft of hair was removed from the burial of the remains of a teenager named Nikita during an inspection of the scene. An expert study found that they did not belong to the victim. It was the hair of another teenager killed a year earlier. These circumstances indicated that the offender had dealt with the victim in one place, the quote-unquote clinic. Another simple conclusion suggested itself. The killer took corpses to the burial place by transport, since there were no settlements nearby, only concrete road and forest all around. End quote. Thus, it became clear that the boa constrictor had acquired a quote-unquote clinic later on, and there he could calmly dismember corpses without fear of being caught off guard. Then the boa took out the remains to the forest. It was clear that he was not killing there, i.e., the burial site was not the site of a murder and subsequent dismemberment. Operatives had already begun to work out more purposefully the version about the identity of the criminal. Particular attention was paid to residents of the city of Zvenigorod, the villages of Javuronki, Golitsuni, Gorky, Pershkushkovu, but by then they took note of everyone who fit into the generalized psychological and social type. The profile was as follows. The suspect acts alone. He is tall, has the skills to work as an anatomist, in a morgue or slaughtering livestock and wild animals. The wanted person most likely has a car, garage, or shed for personal use. The investigation intensified, but the disappearances of children and adolescents did not stop.